Okay. We're going to get underway this morning. I want to thank David Galston, the executive director of Westar, for inviting me to introduce Diana Butler Bass this morning. Diana and I are friends, and my late husband, Marcus Borg, and Diana were also very good friends. Marcus, as many of you may know, was very involved in the Jesus Seminar when it first was undertaken. And so anyway, it's a privilege to be here. And I want to share a little story about how close Diana and Marcus and I are. About a week after Marcus died, and this was in January of 2015, about a week after Marcus died, Diana called me and she said, "Marianne," she said, I had a dream and I just have to tell you about it. She said, I was walking on a road and I was just grieving Marcus's death. And there was somebody who was walking with me, but I didn't really recognize him. Does this story sound a little familiar to you? She said, so I was walking down the road, didn't know who I was really talking to, but, I was really sad about Marcus. And then this person walking next to me called my name, Diana. And I realized in that moment, it was Marcus. And Diana said, I was so thrilled to see Marcus. And Marcus looked at me and he said, Diana, I love you. Diana and I are really good friends. And I said to her, oh, Diana, I said, I'm so happy for you. Really, I'm so happy for you. I hadn't heard a damn thing. But I gave myself a little solace by thinking, well, he's still on the road. So in addition to Diana and Diana's remarkable capacity to communicate with the dead, she is also a highly skilled historian. She draws on history and sociology and psychology as a way of trying to understand our culture, the life of the church, Christianity today, and also as a way of understanding more deeply the workings of our soul. Diana has written many books, and many books that have been honored and given awards. She has perhaps been known as the church lady because of her ability to keep a pulse on what's happening with the American church and sort of anticipate its health. But I would suggest that now Diana will be more recognized and remembered and thought of as Lady Wisdom. So from church lady to Lady Wisdom. And her most recent book, Grateful, The Transformative Power of Giving Thanks in the World, is, if you will, is a kind of exegesis on gratitude. She talks about our taken for granted assumptions about gratitude, but then sort of unpeels layers of understanding what it is. She talks about the structures of gratitude. Some of those have a shadow side, like the way that empires have used it for gratitude and indebtedness and so forth. Oh, but I won't give away too much. These are teasers. And then she also, though, talks about, and you'll be hearing more directly from her, about how gratitude is also literally good for your health and good for your heart. So her work, I think, is incredibly important for us. Let me say one quick thing before I turn it over to Diana. One of the things that Diana does is bring the best of scholarship and integrating that with spirituality and how we live in the world. And to bring all of that into the public arena. This is also the work of Westar, to bring the best of critical scholarship, biblical scholarship together with talking about why does this stuff matter, bringing it into the public square, and letting people know that it's safe to ask questions and be curious and wonder. And Diana has been doing that very work her entire life. So without further ado, I want to introduce and have you help me welcome Diana Butler Bass, a friend of Marcus's and mine, whom we both love.
But we get to be on the road together.
Yeah.
Good morning. I guess that means I'm the holder of the one and only post-resurrection Marcus Borg experience. Anybody else who's got one, let me know. I'll start reporting them to the Vatican. It's good to be with you today, and this is an invitation that is truly both a privilege and an honor to be in the room with colleagues and with friends and with good readers, and to talk about the work that I have done and the work that is about to be born in the world that I think is very, very important. And in order to talk about that today with you, I want to share just a couple pieces of background information, things that have inspired me and that I think about quite a bit. One is this chart. This is a chart of religious affiliation in the United States by age cohort. The line over here being the youngest Americans, this being American adults from 30 to 49, American adults from 50 to 64, and Americans 65 plus. And it's from 2016. There is, I think, a newer chart that I just haven't pulled down from the internet yet from last year. But it's relatively the same. The reason I show you this is that in 2008 or so, about 10 years into my writing career about churches and the state of Christianity and church affiliation in the United States, I began hearing rumors for friends of mine who were sociologists about data sets like this. These data sets were not largely published in 2007 and 2008. They were mostly sitting on the desks of people like you and folks looking at them and trying to figure out what in the world does all this mean. I had graduated from Duke in 1991, so that meant that I was there in the late 80s, and my PhD is in American religious history. I can remember in those days talking about potential demographic shifts in American religion, and one of the things that we were taught is that it was likely that the United States would become more religiously pluralistic in terms of classic world religions. There'd be more people from different Asian religious traditions and also more Muslims in the United States. But there was never a sense in the late 80s and early 90s that this would be a chart that I would be dealing with at the sort of, when I was in my 40s and 50s. And so here it is. This is what religious affiliation looks like in the United States today. And yes, the United States is more pluralistic in terms of great world religions, but it's also way less religious. And in the United States, we were in graduate school and religious studies programs back then, we were specifically taught that the United States was an exception to the European rule of secularization, that there was no way that the United States would ever experience the massive level of church decline that had gone on across Western Europe, even though we saw some evidence of that in the mainline tradition. We saw, as a counterweight, an incredibly robust growth among evangelical churches. And so no one really suspected that the percentage of churchgoers would go down radically. It was just shifting around within the category. But this is what we got. You can see the very obvious thing, being in a room like this, you know how to read charts. But this group of people here, the blues, represent people who are racially white, of European ethnic backgrounds, who are Christians of some form or another. The middle colors, the yellows, the oranges, and the reds, represent people from who are Black and brown and who are Hispanic and from other Asian ethnic backgrounds, African Asian ethnic backgrounds. And then you have the purple, which are world religions, and you can see how that's growing. And then the green number, the big green number, is the percentage of people by age in the United States who are religiously unaffiliated. So when these charts started kind of crossing my desk and I started paying attention to them, as many people were, at first I didn't believe them. I thought, oh my gosh, this is some sort of crazy blip. And then I just sort of got over that and I thought, you know, people always say that when they don't want to see something. They always just think it's a crazy blip. What if we started taking this seriously? And what if I began to write out of this change? What would it look like to write about religious experience, about spiritual experience, about faith, about theology in the public square with this as the template behind my writing? And so that's actually what I've begun to do. That was a set of questions I asked myself. Other people were asking themselves other questions. This chart, of course, is behind issues like seminary enrollments. It is behind issues of your dean fussing with you about the numbers of people engaged in religious studies majors as undergraduates. It is behind a huge amount of our political discussion right now. Clearly, my favorite part of this chart is this dark blue here. Those are the percentage of people who are white evangelicals in each successive generation of Americans. And look at that decline. That is actually the biggest decline on the chart. The mainline decline isn't nearly as large, but this one is rather huge. So that is a huge issue among evangelicals about our social, cultural, and political life. It's a question about how American culture is rearranging itself. Where will faith, where are theological languages, where will religious traditions, where will spiritual practices relocate in the future as this group of young Americans matures? So these are great questions for all of us to be thinking about. I'm fond of telling people when I work with them in churches, it's also the chart that's behind what's happening at your dining room table at Thanksgiving. Because I am frequently still, I just turned 59. I have been the youngest person in every mainline room for my entire career. And I still walk in, and oftentimes I'm the youngest or the second youngest person still in the room. And what's happening now is that I'm in rooms with people who are wonderful, amazing, faithful folks to their traditions, and they're brokenhearted because there's nobody there who's younger than they are. And they don't know how to navigate that territory. So there's a huge amount of emotional space in our culture right now with our aging populations. The fastest growing demographic in America are white women over 80, which is very interesting. And so I hope to be among them one day. That would be very nice. So we have a culture that is on one level aging, but the aging part of our culture is in deep grief because they don't understand what's going on around them. And we also have a culture with the largest amount of younger adults that we've ever had before. And those younger adults feeling remarkably misunderstood by older generations that are still around. And so it's a really interesting cultural moment. And it's this chart that has fueled my imagination. I not only have dreams about Marcus Borg, I have dreams about this chart, and it really informs what I've been doing for the last 3 of my 10 books. The first book I wrote about this was this particular book here, and I'm only showing it to you to show you the subtitle, Christianity After Religion. In other words, what is Christianity going to look like? Because religion apparently is going away. And then the subtitle, The End of Church. I had a lot of people get mad at me for that part. My agent put that there. That's right, blame him. And the birth of a new spiritual awakening. And so in that book, I take an old suggestion by a great historian by the name of William McLaughlin, taught for many years at Brown University, who wrote a quirky, amazing little book about awakenings in American history. The book was written in 1976, was published in 78 by University of Chicago Press. And I took his suggestion that the United States was actually within a period of awakening, not religious decline. And I applied it to what was going on in the aughts. And hence, I followed McLaughlin, which is a kind of a controversial thing to do. Not everybody has always liked his work, but I embraced it fully, really, in this book, and took it on and suggested we were actually in a time of awakening. So that book was published in 2012, and then came Grounded in 2015, and now Grateful is coming out just in 2 weeks. Grounded was an attempt to speak panentheist theology to a Barnes and Noble audience. A lot of people don't know this, but Phil Clayton and I were classmates together in college. And so we've been having really interesting arguments for a very long time, and a great, amazing friendship for a very long time. And part of that friendship roiled around the fact that he has become, of course, a process theologian, philosopher of science, and that I became a historian and sort of social critic and public theologian. And so Phil and I came to this question from very different angles, but have been influential in one another's thinking for a long time. And so I came out of the closet as a panentheist in Grounded, and I talk in the first half of the book about how we discover God in the natural world and why that's important. And then second, how we discover God in the world of neighbors, and how that is equally important, putting those two things together. A God who is deeply and radically immanent in and through and with all things, and why, from a Christian perspective, the doctrine of the incarnation is so important, but how we can also speak that truth in a variety of religious traditions, and how those different traditions grasp hold of that same reality, of that deeply present sacredness. And so that was Grounded. The deep argument in Grounded was to say goodbye to this fellow, because this, of course, is the chap that so many people on that chart have rejected. Every single time I ask someone, tell me about the God you don't believe in, they always describe him, and literally him. And you think about this painting from 1515. I call this painting The God That Haunts the Western Imagination. And I just love it. You could do a whole day on this in a class with undergraduates, because, of course, God is white, so we have a racialized God. God is male, that's pretty obvious. God is special and set apart, marked as different than humankind by that. God is above us, looking down. Ugh. The worst theological move ever. And my favorite part of the painting, perhaps, is that God is cut off at the waist. Thus giving me my other name for this picture, and that is Augustine's Dream Come True God. So in Grounded, I help my audience say goodbye to him and try to open their imagination towards a vision of God that would be like this. I can't promise this painting will still be around in 500 years, But it's also a Catholic painting. This was Italian Catholic, and this is a woman who is a Catholic nun by the name of Ansgar Holmsberg. Guess what state she lives in? Minnesota. That's right. And so Ansgar Holmberg has a series of wonderful icons and paintings where she's trying to depict God's presence here. And what does that look like? And this is one of my favorite. So you have the light, the presence of God pulsating from the center through all of creation. And then, of course, the whole picture is surrounded as well by the presence of light. So I think this is about as close as you get to a painting of panentheism as you possibly can get. So that was Grounded. Now, Grateful. I've run people through that who are folks who might have read my work or who are interested in sort of the longer trajectory of the conversation that I'm trying to spark in culture. Because a lot of people now have looked at Grateful and said, oh, what's going on? As a matter of fact, one of the first reviews came out from a friend of mine who writes just sort of internet reviews. He's located in Toronto. And he said, this is a really interesting book. He said, one of the things I can't figure out about Grateful is that she's clearly left Christian language behind. That this is not a distinctively Christian book. It appears as if, the review says, she is trying to write for the spiritual but not religious part of the North American population that she has so long described. And so I read the review and I tweeted back to him, you get an A. That's exactly right. That's what Grateful is about. And really Grateful, the seeds of it are in Grounded. The very first story I tell in Grounded takes place on this beach in Santa Barbara, California, where I got up at dawn, walked across from the hotel where I was staying, and walked along this beach. This picture was actually taken that morning that I wrote about, and the light was really distinctive on that particular morning. And it was a very, very powerful, powerful moment where I felt the water and the land and the air all together right there at the edge of the continent. And as a result of this sort of sensing these things at some very deep level, I literally fell to my knees and said, thank you. And then I did one other thing that surprised me, and that was I leaned over and I wanted my whole body to touch, to be part of the scene. And so I actually leaned over into the water and I kissed the beach. And I said in the book, I felt so grateful. Now, when I wrote Grounded, I was writing about panentheism for a Barnes & Noble audience. I was not writing a book about gratitude. I was simply trying to explain an experience where I felt the presence of God everywhere and with everything, and that unitive sort of spiritual moment that so many people talk about, either at the beach or the mountains or in a forest or when they're hiking or wherever those kinds of spiritual experiences happen. And when I went back and I reread it, as I was trying to think about what book was calling forth from me next, I read that passage and I said, oh my gosh, maybe I need to pay attention, not just to how I felt, but what I did. And what I did was I was expressing gratitude. And so that became the next project. Putting grounded and gratitude together is kind of an interesting thing. The idea that if we have a grounded life, if we feel ourselves here and now, and we have a sense of the sacred or the divine that is present with us, that gratitude might well be some sort of natural, primal reaction. One, I suspect, that is at the base of the formation of religious traditions. And here was a little tweet that kind of came up along the way. I took a picture of it because I loved it. I wish Lin-Manuel Miranda would stop copying me. He, of course, if you don't know, is the composer, actor, etc. of the great musical Hamilton. And one night when things were particularly bad on political Twitter, Lin-Manuel Miranda came up with this tweet: "Good night, curl up with gratitude. For the ground beneath you, your beating heart, proceed from there. Grounded, grateful, going forward." It's a powerful benediction, and it is actually a powerful suggestion for our lives together now, when so many people are asking the question of what are we going to do? And so I was affirmed by this lovely tweet, and I realized that there was something about this track that was important about the way in which our spiritual lives, our religious traditions, and how a more vibrant forms of faith and ethics might actually be part of the pathway through the cultural anxiety and the pain that we are currently suffering, that there is actually a relationship between being grounded and being grateful. Now, when most people, oh, I forgot about this slide. This is a new show, please forgive me. The sort of overall thing that I discovered in, as I was writing Grateful, is that gratitude emerges from a grounded life. And I care about Christian theology, and I'm trying to write it in interesting and new and different ways that speak in the world. Theologically, it emerges from an abiding sense of and trust in God's presence, gifts, and abundance. That, of course, is from a theist perspective. I work a lot now with people who are post-theists and humanists, and this definition, I think, has plenty of room for a great conversation with people who are not theist. But I have to work from where I am, from what grounds me. And so for me, it is something about the reality of God with us, not that God, this God. And so, but what is it? I asked my Facebook page one day, which I have a private one and a public one. The public one has tons and tons and tons of people in it. The private one is closed because nobody else can join it. It has 5,000 members. It's been active for 10 years. And there are a lot of people in that Facebook community who really like one another and who trust one another, and they really enjoy talking about difficult questions together. And so one day I told the people in that closed community that I was working on this project, and I said, I'm really interested, if someone comes up to you and asks you what gratitude is, what do you say? And probably about 250 people answered the question, and it was fascinating to me that very few answers were alike. They covered a huge range of what people described as gratitude. Now, the bulk of those answers fell into this category. Not all of them, and I'll get to the other ones in a moment, but the bulk of them fell in this category. The gratitude was in some way a feeling. And that was, of course, that Lin-Manuel Miranda tweet as well. Grounded, your beating heart, proceed from there. And so we think of gratitude as related to the heart. Another chart. I love data. I'm so fact-based. It's just distressing sometimes. This little chart came across my desk in November of 2015. You can see right down there. That was when it was released. The data was collected throughout 2014, and Pew Research held this little piece until the next Thanksgiving, of course, when they could release it and do a little story about gratitude. I thought this was absolutely fascinating, is that the question was, have you in the last week felt a strong sense of gratitude? 78% of Americans, nearly 8 out of 10, responded that they had. Now, if there's anybody here who's sociology of religion person, you're probably laughing, because what you know is that that is a ridiculous number. You can very rarely get Americans to agree at a number above 65% on anything. And so what we have in front of us is essentially the answer to the question is that 80% of, rounded up, of Americans want other Americans to think that they're grateful people. But that's fascinating. And I thought it was fascinating because of the way that the question was worded. Look at that. Feel. Gratitude is a feeling. Have you felt grateful in the last week? Well, maybe it is something we want other people to think about us, but chances, hey, maybe 80% of us do feel some inclination of gratitude once a week. Well, that is amazing news. Can gratitude help you recover from a heart attack? This is from the Washington Post just this last February. The answer is yes. And not only a heart attack, but it can also help you in cancer recovery, other major medical events and illnesses, that people who practice gratitude in some shape or another generally are people who have better health outcomes. It's not a prosperity gospel thing. It is an actual real thing that people who are research psychologists, medical researchers, and ethicists have been working on these questions, and they are coming to a remarkable sense of congruity about the answer to this question. And so I showed this slide in a presentation I did in Tucson a few weeks ago. A fellow walked up after the presentation. He said he'd been to his cardiologist that day. Cardiologist said 3 things to him. Change your diet, get more exercise, keep a gratitude journal. And so the answer is yes. This interesting quote from Dan Baker, who wrote a book called What Happy People Know. I was so fascinated. One of the things I love doing in my work is taking fields that don't usually talk to theology and kind of putting them in conversation. And there's an entire field, it's a real thing, called positive psychology. And it's all about the studies of happiness, well-being, health, gratitude, all these things. It's absolutely amazing stuff going on in that field. It's some very well educated people who are really developing this field right now, particularly around the San Francisco Bay Area. There's a place called the Greater Good Center at Berkeley that is really one of the hot spots for this. And then Stanford has a big class on happiness. It's one of the most popular classes ever offered on Stanford. And Palo Alto has a community-wide sort of initiative going of creating a happier Palo Alto. And so it's a little distressing that a place like Palo Alto has to work on happiness, but there are actually some interesting reasons for that, I think, as well. But anyway, Dan Baker, What Happy People Know. It's a real serious book with academic stuff behind it, 2003. And this quote, during active appreciation, in other words, when you're actually practicing gratitude, the threatening messages from your amygdala and the anxious instinct of your brainstem, so all this stuff in the back of your brain, are cut off suddenly and surely from access to your brain's neocortex. And so what this guy is saying is that fear, depression, all these sort of negative emotions associated with anxiety, what they typically will do is they start back here and they will quickly migrate forward to this. And as soon as they migrate forward, what they take over the neocortex, which is the higher thinking capacity in mammals, especially in human beings. And so if this movement happens really quickly, what it does is it institutes that flight or fight mentality that is so associated with fear. But if you are doing active appreciations, if you have a gratitude practice, what it does is it creates a screen, sort of a curtain, between this stuff and what happens here, and it slows down the transfer process. So when the fear instinct moves forward, it encounters this screen of gratitude, which has given your higher thinking space in your brain a chance to consider what's scaring you. And so here you go. So it cuts it off where if they move forward, they fester and replicate themselves and turn all your thought into a cold river of dread. It is a fact of neurology that the brain cannot be in a state of appreciation and a state of fear, appreciation and fear at the same time. The two states may alternate, but they're mutually exclusive. Very interesting things from brain science. So, healthy and less fearful. Robert Emmons, who teaches at UC Davis, who's the leading gratitude researcher in the world, one of the founders of the Greater Good Center in Berkeley. This is a slide from one of his shows. What good is gratitude? Gratitude allows celebration of the present. Gratitude blocks toxic emotions, envy, resentment, regret, depression, and fear, like in that slide. Grateful people are more stress resilient. Gratitude strengthens social ties and self-worth. So when I saw that Pew slide, I immediately thought of all this research I had been reading for the book that I was going to be writing on gratitude, and I got really excited because a large majority of Americans, 78%, feel a strong sense of gratitude or thankfulness on a weekly basis. Only 6% of us say that we seldom or never experience those feelings. So that means that Americans are the most celebrative, present-oriented, least fearful, least depressed, most stress resilient, and best socially grounded people on the entire planet. And that was in November of 2015. Well, thank God for Public Religion Research Institute, because at the exact same time, also released 2 days later after that Pew study, Public Religion Research was doing a survey trying to discern the emotional attitude of the American electorate going into the 2016 election. And what they found out was this, is that Americans were actually more full of fear and anxiety, more committed to the idea that the past was better than what was happening now or in the future, so more nostalgic, and more mistrustful of each other and institutions than ever before. And this is one of those moments when you look at both of the surveys and you say, I wish my colleagues would just talk to one another. You know, what the heck is going on here? And so this tension between these two sets of data pushed me into the journey of this book. The gratitude gap. And one of the things that I think has happened is that we have privatized gratitude and made it deeply individualistic, but that it is removed from our common life. So if you ask people on one hand if they feel grateful, I'm going to take the 78% seriously. Okay, 8 out of 10 people will say that they have felt grateful in the last week. Not a far stretch. I can give that point up. But when you ask them a different set of questions about particular toxic emotions related to public issues, then the toxic part of American culture emerges full force. And so this becomes the question. What do we do about this? How do we understand how we got here, and what is it all about? It took me to a surprising place, and that is I didn't really understand what gratitude was. So I went back to that question. What is it that people are talking about when they talk about gratefulness? And I began to consider the idea that gratitude might have shape and form. One of the things that drives me most crazy as a writer, as somebody who comments about religion in public square, and as a scholar, frankly, is the fact that people insist on saying that spirituality is amorphous. and that it's vague, and that it does not have shape or form. All the work that I've been doing in the last 10 years actually points exactly the other direction, is that there really is shape and structure to our spiritual lives, but oftentimes it's invisible to us. And so to begin to lift up those structures and see how people pattern their lives around these deeper senses of sacredness, the divine, their ethical choices, all of these things, is really to begin to see the structure of spirituality. And so if I have been arguing this, which I had been, I began to wonder, is there a shape and form to gratitude? Even though people think it's amorphous. There I was on the beach, thank you. Or what we feel in our hearts, or that thing that keeps us from having medical catastrophes. The only person that I could find who had written anything on the structure of gratitude was this guy, every liberal's favorite conservative, including mine. Although I really like Steve Schmidt these days. I think that he's doing an amazing job trying to repent of that Sarah Palin thing. And it's like this big public repentance that tour he's on. So anyway, but David Brooks wrote this article in the summer of 2015 called The Structure of Gratitude. And in it, he was talking about really the problem that I was just pointing out with those two surveys, although he didn't have access to them a couple months earlier, where he was wondering out loud that if we had a more robust sense of gratitude in American society, would it make our cultural and political life different? And of course, his answer was that it would, but he only had 600 words to write about that. So this is one thing that came up. And this is what I explore in Grateful. In a sense, people ask me what the new book is about. I say it is a deep political theology disguised as a self-help book. And that's what it is. We'll see if anybody listens. And so the first piece, this is the rest of this morning session, or excuse me, until 10 o'clock until we break, as I want to talk about this part of it. And in the next session after the break, I'll talk about what's the external structure of gratitude. But right now, the internal complexity piece. This part is really much more founded on issues around sort of social science and psychology. And you can see where religious studies and ethics links into it. The second half is more specifically theological. So let's look at this. The internal complexity of gratitude. That's really one of the first postures that we think of when we think of gratitude. This is a posture, of course, of awe, of vulnerability, the open heart to the world. If you ask somebody to show you a posture of gratitude, it very well might be a posture like that. But they're not. This is not the only one. These are also postures of gratitude. I love that fellow. I think his smile is fantastic. His hands over his heart. Thank you. You can just feel it in the photograph. Or this woman down here in the corner, clearly a posture of gratitude. As a matter of fact, any of you who text your children or grandchildren at college will know that if you ever type grateful in the text line, the emoji that comes up is this. Pictures of gratefulness. But those aren't the only kinds of pictures you can take of gratefulness. That one. That one I'm terrible at. Indeed, when I was 14 years old, my mother gave me a book that I will never forget. Every year, I always feel like Laura Ingalls Wilder when I tell this story. Every year at Christmas, we'd get one book under the Christmas tree. We'd get other things too. It wasn't just like getting an orange in our stocking like Laura Ingalls Wilder did at Christmas. But we'd get one book among a few other presents. And every year, I just waited for that book. So I'm 14 years old. I go and I pull the book out from underneath the tree. I pull the paper off, and it's Miss Manners. And there was a bookmark right in the section, how to write thank you notes. It was literally the most passive aggressive Christmas present I have ever received. I'm terrible at it. And when my daughter was little, I tried to get her to do this. She was terrible at it too. I have actually had friends who are good at it and who love to do this, but it was just really bad for me. But it is a picture of gratefulness, that sense of acknowledgement, of writing that note and letting someone know you appreciate them. It might be the note, or it could be something like this. Teacher getting an apple, a person hosting a dinner party, getting a bottle of wine, someone who has allowed you to stay at their house as their guest. Maybe you send them flowers afterwards. A gift, you return a gift for a gift. And so a thank you note or a gift. This is also a picture of thankfulness. These are Chicago Cubs fans. And this photograph was taken the moment the scoreboard at Wrigley Field lit up that said, Cubs win. And we don't think about this so much as being a picture of gratefulness, but it really is. Indeed, the curse is broken, the people are free. This is a moment of liberation. Everybody pours out onto the streets. They are so thankful that they have witnessed the very thing that their grandparents longed for. And so it is an amazing event of sort of public celebration, ecstasy, and gratitude. And I love these kinds of events. They happen sometimes. They happen around, often around sports in our culture, but they can also happen in festivals of all sorts. Some cities are really good at holding big public festivals with music and art and all those kinds of things. And they can happen around politics, in which they have kind of a two-sided feature, some for good and some for ill. But these public displays of gratitude where lots of people together are thankful. This is a more restrained vision of a lot of people being thankful together. It's a little bit more programmatic, but it is still, it's a feast. So here we have a picture of American Thanksgiving or Canadian Thanksgiving, same basic foods. And people sitting around a table, they're not fighting about politics. At least they look like they like each other. Nobody's throwing the pie in anybody else's face. And so, so a feast, we could also put in here, but as part of my quest to create larger audiences for my work, if you happen to be a Christian, you might have a picture of the Eucharist up here instead of this. A ritualized feast in community where people are sharing gratitude. So, gratitude. And then this, a group of people sending a thank you note. This just appeared on the internet. I'm not exactly sure what this group of young adults is, but they look like they might run a preschool, or that they've done, that they have some sort of social good project that has gotten some money in perhaps, and they are thanking their donors publicly. And so a picture like this goes up on Facebook or Twitter or however that happens to work these days. But it's a group of people actually publicly thanking. So it's not just an expression, it's not just a sort of a ritualized group, but it's a public expression of thank you by a number of people. Or you can have this happen as thank you. And that is people who recognize that they have been given much, turn around to give back to others. And so these kinds of events, this one happens to be Thanksgiving, everything but the turkey. It's a group of millennials. I showed this in a church, and the nice people in the church said, look at all those young church people. Do you think we can get them to come to us? And I had to tell them that it was actually a secular business group. And so I said, why don't you go and help out the secular business millennials and then just make friends with them and see what would happen. But so anyway, this is not a church group. This is not a synagogue group. This is just a group of young adults who recognize that their lives have been gifted and so that they are giving back. Now, I call that my little photo album of gratitude. You might be thinking, the kind of pictures you might add to your photo album, what's actually on your phone right now, which might count as a photo of gratefulness. But what they do is they divide up into 4 rough categories. And these are the 4 categories that actually emerged out of that question that I asked on Facebook. When I asked people what gratitude was, the majority of people's answers fell into the idea that we were talking about feelings, but not exclusively. There were plenty of people in that 250 or so responses who talked about other things as well. They talked about stuff like sending thank you notes or giving thank you gifts. They talked about celebrations as Thanksgivings. And they talked about public sort of acts of returning gifts for gifts, where groups of people contributed together to making their communities better. And I realized that, hey, gratitude really has a multitude of faces. And this is how I conceptualize it in the book, in this circle of gratitude, is that gratitude is a feeling, that it is something that does emerge from our hearts, oftentimes spontaneously, as a surprise, without us planning it in any way, shape, or form. It just shows up. It shows up as a result of awe. It shows up as a result of relief. It shows up as a result of someone giving us a present, and we feel sort of humbled, all those things. So it's a feeling, and then it's also an action. It's something we do. So it's an emotion or set of emotions, and it's an ethic. And then, of course, it has 2 additional dimensions, and that is it can be personal. It's about me, or each one of us, about me, and it is about we. As I went around in the book, I really take this circle as the framework for the whole of the book. There are 8 main chapters, 2 on each one of these sections, 2 short chapters on each one of these sections. And what is obvious in the culture of the United States is that we emphasize the personal, and most people, I think, see it primarily over here as a feeling, but there are people who do see it as an ethic, like my mom. This part, the public, has been the less well-traveled discussion about gratitude. And occasionally, Barbara Ehrenreich wrote an amazing book called Dancing in the Streets. And it really, I don't know that she actually ever uses the word grateful or thankful in the book. But when I reread the book for this project, I realized that she was describing gratitude sort of everywhere within the book. And so Dancing in the Streets winds up being a great discussion of that kind of communal response to gifts and abundance. And then this piece here is discussed, and that's what we'll talk about in the second section, but it is discussed badly. And we need to be able to change the one discussion that we have about that 4th piece of the pie there. So what I suggest in this book is that in order to really, truly live more gratefully, it's helpful to pay attention to all 4 of these things. And I realized as I went further, sharing with friends and talking to people in my life and talking to clergy I know, is that people tend to lean more strongly into one over the other 3. It's very few of us that sort of come out of the gate with kind of a balanced vision of gratitude. As a matter of fact, I almost had a fight with a woman who I was presenting this whole show to a few weeks ago as I was just getting it up and running. And okay, so I am this person here. I have a lot of sympathy for those 80% because I'm a me and emotions person. If you do something nice for me, if you give me a gift, I will feel it. I will be so appreciative. I will cry. I will be your friend forever. I will be deeply loyal to you. You can ask Marianne. Is that if somebody does something for me that is meaningful and purposeful, are we off? No, that's okay. Meaningful and purposeful, and that affirms something I was sort of doubting about myself. it makes me feel amazing. And I also have a very high capacity for awe and wonder and surprise and all those kinds of things. And so I'm a very emotional person, and I feel it very deeply. This piece over here, as I already said, always kinds of eludes me. The idea that somebody would make me write a thank you note, or someone, I always forget to bring the presents. Now, the woman that I had the argument with in the presentation, she was exclusively this. It was really interesting because she's an African-American clergy person. And she literally got up during the event and said I was a terrible person who was ill-formed in gratitude because I didn't do this. And then she went on to talk about her mother and her grandmother and how they taught her that this thing here was the whole sum total of gratitude. And I felt absolutely miserable because I really did not know how to respond to this. But what we were having in public was a conflict of our experiences and our definitions of gratitude, just almost in the same way that my mom and I used to have. And that, of course, made me feel like I was about 3 years old. And I started just sinking into the floor. But it was also an illustration of the general point, is that she grew up in a culture that was highly attuned to the actual ethical practices of doing stuff for other people about gratitude. And to her, that was the definition. And so we had to sort of work into that space and say, okay, yeah, maybe there is a different way of seeing this. I have known people who are in the we and emotions category. Those are my kinds of friends that as soon as something great happens, they throw a party. And they invite everybody around them. And usually they're a whole lot of fun and very spontaneous types. And then I also have known these sorts of people, the we and ethics people. I've known a lot of those kinds of people at church, interestingly enough. I happen to be an Episcopalian. Those people are usually on the altar guild. And believe me, if you're a minister who does not publicly say thank you to those people, you will be fired. Yeah, it's really the case. And so what we have are these misunderstandings about gratitude between us as individuals, and I think that we have several layers of cultural misunderstanding about gratitude. And so we're getting ready to wrap up this first section. What I conclude in the book is that this internal complexity makes gratitude rather difficult to understand. And so if we see it and we see these 4 different possibilities, we can begin to set a table in our own lives and in our communities where we could have a more robust practice, a more robust understanding, a sort of more robust formation in gratitude as part of the communal ethical lives that we share. And so that's the first structure of the book, is to take people into that question, asking what is gratitude, knowing that gratitude is good, but there is some problem. And what we have to do is overcome this gap, this gratitude gap. The first step is to define it better, and then move on to what I call the external structure. So this is where I'm stopping for the first part. It is pretty much 10 o'clock straight up. I love breaks as a person who attends lots of lectures myself. So I want you to go and have a great half an hour. Get some coffee, get some water, talk to one another. Write down little thoughts, questions, issues that you want to raise with me during our conversational parts. And don't lose those thoughts until, don't lose the thoughts from this morning, because what's coming is even more surprising, I think. So thank you very much for your attention.